Hey guys, it's Landon Blake with Redefined Horizons, and this is the third video in our Spring 2020 Land Title Webinar Series, third video of part one. And in this video, we're going to talk about the English and Roman roots of the U.S. land title system. So we're going to cover a little bit of history here. I'm going to try really hard not to put you to sleep. It's really kind of a cool story that we're going to talk about today. The history is really important to understanding why our system works the way it does in the United States, our land title system, and even some of the terminology we use today. You can't understand that terminology unless you understand the history. So this is going to be too brutal. I'm hoping it's 10 or 15 minutes, and I'm just going to kind of go over the basic story that kind of founded the land title system that we have in the United States. So this is important. I've actually got a book that I want to show you. So most of the information that we're going to talk about today comes from this book, An Introduction to the Law of Real Property. And it's by Cornelius, I don't know how you say his last name, Moynihan, Cornelius. It's an old book, but it's the best summary I've found to date on the kind of the English roots of the U.S. real property system and the land title system. So it's a good book. A little bit of what we're going to talk about today comes from the book on land tenure that I'm covering in another set of videos. When we talk about the Roman contributions to the land title system, that's where that comes from. And then when we do video 4 on the recording system in the United States, I'm going to talk about some information from this book. This is the 8th edition of the book on property law, and there's a number of authors here: Mr. Cribbett, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Finley, and Mr. Smith. This is also an old book, but it's got some good. There's some good information in some old books. Okay, so in this book, Introduction to the Law of Real Property, in the very first chapter, on the very first page, there's a quote which says, "A thorough understanding of land law is impossible without a knowledge of its historical background." So that's why we're talking about some history today. So the imprint of the past, the book says, is still visible, still discernible in the present. And we're going to see some ways that that is true. So the English roots of the land title system really start with a battle in medieval England. It was called the Battle of Hastings. And this was a battle between King William and King Harold. And they were fighting over the English throne. And King Harold was kind of the native English guy. King William was from France, a part of France called Normandy. He actually didn't speak very much English. He spoke French. That's part of how we ended up with French words in English. So King William, who later became known as William the Conqueror, defeated King Harold and his armies. Well, they were called Saxons. So William the Conqueror defeated King Harold and his Saxons. So the people from Normandy were called Normans. The natives from England were called Saxons. So King William defeats King Harold and basically takes over England. Okay, so why is that important? Well, everybody that supported King Harold, so the existing English nobles, were either killed or forced into exile. So there were these huge tracts of land in England that basically the men that owned them were either dead or gone, dead or missing in action. So what that allowed William the Conqueror to do was he was able to redistribute that land to his key men, the men that fought with him in battle, the people that supported him, and that's what he did. I don't know if he took all of England and redistributed it, but he took most of it. If he didn't take all of it, he took most of it. There were some lands that the church had that they managed to hold on to, but basically William the Conqueror took all the land and redistributed it. It was a huge redistribution effort it's really amazing what they were able to accomplish. Of course, they did it at the tip of a sword. So I'm neutral on whether or not William the Conqueror was a bad guy or a good guy. It doesn't really matter. The system we have today for land title is because he won that battle and the system he instituted. So William the Conqueror takes this land in England and distributes it to his best buddies. Okay, so 10 of his closest associates were given almost a quarter of England. So kind of started at the top with those 10, and then as he went down the ranks, you know, the other people that fought with him were given land. So in essence, all the land in England was owned by the king. So he was the owner, and he would let people he liked use the land. They could occupy the land and use it. So when William the Conqueror granted land to each of these nobles, it wasn't a grant of ownership. It was a right to occupy and to use. Okay, and so that means if you tick the king off, he could take your land back. And when you died, he took your land back. And if you insulted his wife, he took your land back. So all the power was really with the king, but he granted this land and allowed his nobles to use it, to occupy it. And in return, they had to swear an oath of loyalty, and they had to provide him with knights whenever he needed knights to defend the kingdom. And so that was how that worked. That system was called the feudal system, Feudal. Feudal tenure is what it's called. Tenure is this idea of you get to occupy land, but you owe something for it. That's kind of the basic idea of tenure. So when you owed knights for your land, that was called military tenure. Okay, so occupancy of the land under that system carried with it the burdens that we mentioned, the burden of loyalty and the burden to provide military service, and that burden actually attached to the land itself. So if Knight Blake had the land, he had to be loyal, and he had to provide 10 knights, let's say. But if Landon died or was removed from his land to the king, and Knight Cazares got the land, well, then Knight Cazares had the same obligation that Knight Blake had. The obligation was attached to the land itself. So whoever occupied the land had to take on that obligation. That was a burden on the land. That's a legal concept that we have today. And really, you couldn't have a right to occupy the land unless you had a piece of paper from the king, signed by the king, that said that land was yours to use and occupy. So England had a paper title system. It was not a system based on possession. It was based on paper title, and all the paper title had to trace back to the king. We see elements of that, of course, today in our own land title system. All right, so all these nobles get this land from King William, and they had to supply knights. And there were some problems with having knights running around your castle. They were rowdy. They carried big swords. They probably tried to do inappropriate things with your daughter. And so, they drank too much. So over time, these nobles were like, hey, I know I owe the king X amount of knights. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give all these knights their own little piece of land. And then get them out of my house, get them out of my castle, and then when I need them, they got to come. They're going to owe me military service just like I owe military service to the king. So it was kind of this pyramid shape, right? King was at the top, then you had the nobles underneath, then you had the knights underneath that, and there was multiple levels. Okay, so the land that was given to a knight, that parcel land was called a knight's fee, F-E-E, because the fee to occupy the land was one knight. So it's called a knight's fee. So now you understand why we call the actual ownership of land in our land title system fee simple absolute, right? The word fee comes from the fee that you used to have to pay to get a parcel of land, which was one knight. Okay? So these nobles and the knights had this land. The land was typically farmed by the peasants, okay? And the peasants in the beginning basically had no rights. Okay, so you were essentially property of the lord or the noble or the knight you served your lord. You were property, and you basically served at his will. You couldn't leave the property without his permission. You couldn't get married without his permission. You basically couldn't do anything without his permission. And your ability to occupy your house depended on the grace and goodwill of your lord. So if you ticked your lord off, you're going to be homeless. That's basically how that worked. So the tenant of the land owed loyalty and service to the lord, and then in return, the lord had to protect and defend his tenant, and especially the lord had to protect his tenant against anybody else that claimed the right to occupy his land. So if I was a noble and I gave land to a knight, I gave him a knight's fee, right? And some other noble said, hey, that's my land. I had an obligation to defend my knight's claim to his land. I had to defend. That was a duty I had as a lord, right? So you can kind of see from that idea where we get the concept of a warranty deed, right? Which is a deed where you grant somebody property and you promise that you are going to defend them against other claims that they don't own what you sold them, right? That's where that concept comes from. So over time, the nobles and the tenants got more and more rights. Okay, so the king and the nobles lost rights. So the king lost rights that the nobles gained. The nobles lost rights that the knights gained. The knights lost rights that the peasants gained. And so over time, individual landowners got more and more powerful. That's because kings did stupid stuff. They started wars, got themselves in trouble. And then when the Black Plague came through, a lot of the peasants died. And so there was a tight labor market, essentially, and peasants were in a good position. They were negotiating from a position of strength. So eventually, a lot of the rights that didn't come with land were obtained by the peasants, the knights, and the nobles. So I'll give you some examples. These are things we take for granted today, but these are rights that people had to fight for through English history. So one was the right to pass your land on to your heirs. So in the beginning, when you died, the king got your land back. He could give it to whoever he wanted. So they changed that, and after a while, the king had to give your land to one of your heirs, but he got to pick the heir. So he still had a lot of power. So eventually they changed that. They said, no, the nobles get to give their land to the heir that they choose. Okay, and then for a while there were some rules there about guardianship and marriage, and if you died and your daughter or son was under a certain age, the Lord basically had control, and your daughter couldn't marry who she wanted, and you had to pay money to do anything. And it was kind of a messed up system from an American perspective. So over time, those rules changed. You could pass your land on to your heir. It could go to the heir that you chose. Your daughter didn't have to marry the ugly nobleman that the Lord or the king wanted her to marry. She could marry who she wanted without losing her land. Eventually, you had the right to sell your land. So it used to be you'd have to get the Lord's permission to sell your land, and then he took a fee. And then after a while, that changed. You didn't have to get the Lord's permission to sell your land. And then eventually, the common people won the right to access court to settle land disputes. So you didn't have to depend on your Lord to defend your ownership of a particular piece of property. You could go to a court, and a court could help you defend your right to ownership, so you weren't as dependent on the grace of your Lord. So over time, individual landowners gained more and more rights. The system of military tenure faded away. But that original system that was set up by William the Conqueror basically forms the skeleton of the land title system that we have today. And we'll talk some more as we move through the different videos. We'll talk about how these ancient rules are still visible. The imprint is still visible, discernible today, like it says in this book by Cornelius here. Okay, so we're almost done with this video, but I want to touch briefly on the influence of Roman law. So the Roman civil code, Romans were, they kind of were the founders of democracy, and they had a civil code, and a lot of our rules related to water boundaries and access to rivers and lakes and oceans come from the Romans. So the Romans had this idea that waterways were like highways, and everybody had the right to travel those waterways and to tie their boats up on the bank and to do different things like that. But that the owners owned the bank, and that if land, accreted to one side of a bank of a river, that land was owned by the adjacent upland owner. And so a lot of those principles that we find related to water boundaries and navigable bodies of water that are in the U.S. land title system come from the Roman civil code. Of course, there's other influences on the land title system in the United States. There's Spanish influences. So we have a lot of that here in California. Stockton is in a Spanish land grant, for example. They have different rules about things like rivers. There was Russian influences. There were French influences. Basically, any of the major powers, imperial powers that had land claims or colonies in the United States, we've got some of that flavor in our law, depending on what state you're in. But as a general rule, the majority of our law comes from the English common law, the English system, and there are influences of Roman law as well in most places. Okay, so now you've got a little bit of the history behind the U.S. real property system, the U.S. land title system. What we're going to talk about in video 4 is we're going to go over the recording system and why we have a recording system for land transactions in America.